The room was silent, except for the steady hum of the fluorescent light overhead. My hands were still cuffed, even though I hadn't moved for hours. I stared at the black-gloved officer standing behind the one-way mirror, wondering how many minutes, or maybe days, I had left. They told me nothing. Just escorted me from my post without a word. No shouting, no accusations. Only silence and those cold eyes that had already sentenced me. But I wasn't a traitor. I didn't plan anything. I didn't ask to see what I saw. The suitcase had a red tag. That meant high priority. According to protocol, if the X-ray scanner failed, we were required to open and inspect it manually, no matter who the owner was. So I did. And inside, I found something that was never meant for my eyes. Blueprints, satellite images, names and locations, scribbled in codes I didn't understand, but one photo stood out. It showed a facility hidden deep in the forest, surrounded by high fencing and chemical hazard signs. I only looked for seconds, but that was enough. An hour later, I was no longer an employee of the state. I was a liability. And when you become a liability in North Korea, you disappear. My name is Kang Min-soo. I was 33 years old when my life became a file in a locked drawer somewhere in the Ministry of State Security. Before that, I was invisible in the best possible way. For 7 years, I worked as a luggage inspector at Pyongyang Special Aviation Terminal, an airport you won't find on any map. It serves no tourists, no commercial flights, only the elite, high-ranking officials, military commanders, foreign envoys who never speak Korean, and occasionally, someone whose name no one dares to whisper. My job wasn't glamorous, but it came with its own kind of safety. I wore the same uniform every day, scanned the same metal cases, and followed the same protocols. The rules were strict, but simple. Never ask questions. Never delay. Never open what's sealed, unless instructed. The fewer the mistakes, the longer you lasted. Most of us didn't know each other's real names. We were addressed by position or number. I was simply Unit 4, Post B. But in exchange for anonymity, we were granted stability, regular rations, electricity in our dormitories, access to proper medical care, and a tiny apartment for my wife and son inside a restricted residential block near the airfield. It wasn't luxury, but in a country where millions lived in hunger and darkness, it was enough to feel lucky. I never considered myself political. I believed in doing my part, keeping my head down. That's what my father taught me, a factory supervisor who lost his hand in an accident and was still expected to complete his quota. He used to say, "Be the machine, not the oil." I followed that advice for most of my life. The airfield was heavily guarded, but surprisingly quiet. No planes took off without clearance from the inner circle. Every shipment was labeled, timed, and escorted. We didn't know what was inside most of the crates or cases. We didn't need to, and honestly, I didn't want to. Until the morning the scanner failed, and the red-tagged suitcase was handed to me. My days followed a rhythm so predictable it could have been printed on a schedule. Wake at 5:30. Physical check-in at 6. Briefing at 7. Scan. Verify. Report. Repeat. I learned to find comfort in repetition. In a country where a single misstep could lead to re-education or worse, routine was a kind of safety blanket. At the terminal, my station overlooked the second corridor, the one used exclusively by those with black license plates. I'd see generals arriving in polished cars, sometimes with aides who kept their eyes fixed to the floor. I never dared to look too long. Eye contact meant curiosity. Curiosity meant risk. But life outside the checkpoint had its quiet joys. My wife, Hae-jin, was a nurse at the local clinic. She always wore her hair in a tight bun and had a habit of packing my lunch with little handwritten notes, never sentimental, always practical. Eat quickly today. Forecast says cold wind. Or, Boil the eggs before storing them. We had a 6-year-old son, G1, who loved drawing airplanes. Every weekend, I would take him to the edge of the restricted fence, where he could spot the tail fins of private jets rising above the hangars. He thought I was a kind of pilot, and I didn't correct him. There was no harm in letting him believe his father flew planes, not just inspected the bags that went inside them. We didn't talk politics at home. No one did. Even within family, silence was the safest language. We spoke about food, school, heating rations, and whether the neighbors were moving away or being moved. Sometimes, I'd pass through the market and hear whispers of someone who had disappeared after a late shift, or a supervisor who never returned from his assignment. We nodded in understanding but kept walking. What else could we do? In my mind, I had built a wall between my job and my soul. I didn't ask what was inside the crates. I didn't question why certain names were never spoken twice. As long as I followed the rules, my family was safe. That was the unspoken agreement. But even the most carefully built walls crack when pressure rises from within. I didn't know it then. But the suitcase was already on its way. It was a Thursday. I remember because the cafeteria had served soy paste stew, and Hai Jin had warned me in her note, "Avoid the eggs. They smell off." A cold wind had started blowing across the tarmac, and the sky above the airfield was the color of old concrete. That morning, the X-ray scanner at Station B began to glitch. The screen flickered, then went black. Normally, in such cases, we were instructed to redirect bags to the backup line. But there had been a last-minute arrival, an unscheduled flight from the North Hamgyong region, carrying a single passenger with 4 guards, and no name on the manifest. The suitcase was large, silver, and had a red tag on the handle. That color meant priority for Central Command. Most red-tagged items passed through untouched, often with their own escorts. But this time, with the scanner down, protocol required manual inspection. My supervisor looked at me and gave a curt nod. Open it. Verify. Record. No delays. I wheeled the suitcase to the inspection bay, put on gloves, and clicked open the latches. Inside were folders. Not clothes. Not personal effects. Just thick black folders, neatly aligned, each marked with dates and codes I didn't recognize. No names. No seals. Just one word stamped in red ink across the top sheet of the first folder. Restricted. I hesitated. I shouldn't have. But it was protocol. I flipped open the top folder to record contents for the log. The first page was a blueprint, hand-drawn, but precise. It depicted an underground facility, multiple levels, air ventilation systems, chemical storage zones. The annotations were in technical shorthand, with labels I didn't fully grasp, terms like VX dispersion tunnel, batch 14, a toxicity controls, and containment zone breach alarms. I turned the page. A satellite image followed, grainy, but clear enough to recognize terrain. A massive fenced compound buried in dense forest, its roof camouflaged to match the surrounding hills. One corner of the image had handwritten coordinates. Another photo showed men in hazmat suits near a sealed entry chamber. My pulse began to race. I had no clearance for this. No context. No way of unseeing what I had just seen. I closed the folder immediately. My hands trembled. I latched the suitcase shut, logged, cleared, manual inspection, and returned it to the conveyor. I told no one. I thought I had buried it. But the system saw everything. Exactly 54 minutes later, 2 men in black uniforms entered my booth. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't ask questions. "You're being reassigned for debrief," one of them said. I was escorted off-site, not through the employee gate, but through an unmarked corridor I had never seen before. That was the last time I saw the sky over Pyongyang. They locked me in a room with no windows, no clock, and no name. Just 4 gray walls, a steel chair, and a table bolted to the floor. The fluorescent light above never turned off. I lost track of time within the first day, or maybe it was the second. It didn't matter. My name no longer mattered. They didn't beat me. That would have been too crude. What they did was more effective. Silence. Observation. Isolation. I was questioned in intervals I couldn't measure. The interrogators rotated, but their questions remained the same. Why did you open the suitcase? Who gave you the order? Did you make a copy of the documents? Did you speak to anyone? Each time, I gave the same answer. I followed protocol. Each time, they responded with the same blank stare, as if I had said nothing at all. They knew I wasn't lying. But the truth didn't matter. One day, after what felt like a week, a man in a civilian suit came in. He was different. He didn't sit, didn't ask, just placed a photograph on the table and looked at me. It was G1, my son, standing in front of our apartment building, holding a toy airplane. I hear he likes planes, the man said, his tone casual. My mouth went dry. He's healthy. Your wife too. For now. That was the first time I felt true fear, not for myself, but for them. I understood the message. I was no longer the target. They had leverage. And in a regime like ours, leverage was the sharpest knife. They didn't need a confession. They needed a scapegoat, an erasure, something tidy to present to the files. Breach resolved. Responsible party removed. The next day, I was told I'd be transferred to a retraining facility in the north. A place I had only heard of in whispers, hidden beyond mountains, where men were worked until they forgot their names. That night, alone in the holding cell, I made a decision. I had spent my whole life obeying rules, building walls, believing that loyalty would protect me. But now those same walls were collapsing, and no rule could save me or my family. Escape had never crossed my mind before. It was unthinkable, unrealistic. And yet, what else was left? I remembered a technician I once worked with, Park Ji-sung, who had disappeared a year ago under mysterious circumstances. Rumor had it he had contacts outside, that he knew a route. I began to reconstruct everything I remembered about him. His habits, his network, his silence. The next time the guards came to escort me for questioning, I stumbled. I clutched my stomach, vomited on the floor. I begged for medical attention. They didn't care. But protocol required a health check before transfer. I was sent to a low-security infirmary outside the main facility. And there, I saw the first window in weeks. A narrow crack of light, covered with mesh, but enough to remind me what the sky looked like. Enough to plan the first step out. The infirmary was outdated, cold, and smelled of iodine and rust. But it wasn't guarded like the main facility. The nurses were bored, underpaid, and too used to quiet patients. I saw it in their eyes. They didn't care who I was, only that I stayed still and took my pills. On the second night, during a routine vitals check, I made my move. When the nurse stepped out, I unlatched the window mesh using a metal shard I'd hidden in my bandages. I knew I had minutes at most. The back corridor led to a waste disposal yard. A service truck had parked there earlier that day, covered in grime, its rear hatch partially open. I slipped out and climbed into the refuse compartment, burying myself under torn medical gowns and plastic bins. It reeked of disinfectant and blood. I held my breath as the truck rattled to life. Hours passed. My limbs cramped. My ears rang with every bump and halt. I didn't know where I was going, only that it was away. At dusk the next day, the truck stopped at a regional depot. While workers unloaded bins, I rolled out into the shadow of the compound and limped away through a drainage canal. I didn't look back. I walked for 2 days. No map, no food, just the distant memory of a rumor that somewhere near the Yalu River, in a cluster of mining villages, there were smugglers who could get you across. I kept off main roads, slept beneath culverts, and stole boiled corn from unattended stalls. Once, I was chased by a patrol unit near a checkpoint and hid beneath a collapsed wooden bridge, neck deep in freezing water as they passed above. By the fourth night, my legs were blistered and my lips cracked from dehydration. But I found what I had been searching for: an abandoned warehouse near a rural rail line. There, I met a man named Choi, a former soldier turned broker, who didn't ask my name. He only said, "You have money?" I had nothing. Only my wedding ring and the watch I was given after 5 years of service. I gave them both. He nodded. "We leave tomorrow." At dawn, we boarded a truck with tarps tied over its cargo. Beneath the sacks were 3 others, like me: a woman in her 40s with a burned hand, a teenager barely able to speak, and a man who had once been an airbase mechanic. We were all broken in our own ways, but we shared one thing: silence. We rode through unpaved roads, across farming fields and checkpoints greased with cigarettes and bottles of alcohol. At one point, a border guard opened the tarp and stared straight at me. I didn't breathe. Choi handed him a carton of foreign soap and the guard walked away. That night, we reached the river. The Yalu was narrow at this bend, but the current was fast. China was visible on the other side, a distant world bathed in flickering lights. We stripped down, tied our clothes to our backs, and stepped into the icy water. Every stroke felt like a knife. Halfway through, the woman screamed, her foot caught on something. Choi doubled back to free her, and we barely made it across without drifting downstream. We collapsed onto Chinese soil, panting, shivering. No words, no relief. Just fear, because being in China didn't mean we were safe. We hid in the hills for 2 days. Choi made contact with a Korean-Chinese church network in the area. They sent a van. No windows, no markings. Inside were warm blankets and a woman who spoke fluent Korean with a soft accent. She said, "You're not safe yet, but you're closer than you've ever been." For weeks, we moved from town to town, through safe houses and back alleys. I learned to stay invisible. At one point, we were nearly caught during a raid, and I hid in a grain silo for 11 hours without water. Finally, after what felt like months, I arrived at the South Korean embassy in a Southeast Asian country. I won't say which. They checked my identity, verified my story. Then they said 7 words I had never dared to dream of. "You will be flown to Seoul next week." That night, for the first time in years, I slept without shoes on. I arrived in Seoul on a rainy afternoon. The first thing I noticed was the lights everywhere. Inside the airport, along the roads, inside the bus that took us to Hanwon. Even in the bathroom, the lights stayed on. I hadn't realized how much of my life had been lived in shadows. At Hanwon, they gave me a bed, 3 hot meals, and a small orientation folder. They asked questions, but no one shouted, no one accused, no one took me away in the middle of the night. The staff smiled. It was strange at first, unsettling even. I kept waiting for the mask to drop, for the real face to appear underneath. But it didn't. I learned how to open a bank account, how to use a microwave, how to search the internet. The first thing I looked up was a satellite map of North Korea. I zoomed into the region where I believed the facility had been the one in the photo. It was just forest now, or maybe it had always been. I still don't know if what I saw that day was a real project, or a phantom designed to scare or impress foreign visitors. Maybe it doesn't matter, because what it showed me, what it proved, was that the system had no room for accidents. Even loyalty could be punished. Even silence could be seen as a threat. I found a small apartment in Incheon. I work in a warehouse now. I don't inspect bags anymore. I lift them. Hai-jin and Ji-won are not with me. Not yet. I don't know if they're safe or even alive. I wrote letters. Many. I sent them through unofficial channels, hoping they would reach someone. Anyone. No reply has come. Every night, I sit by the window and leave a small light on, just in case. Some days, I wonder if I did the right thing, if escaping was courage or betrayal. But then I remember that moment, back in that cold interrogation room, when they placed Ji-won's photo on the table. And I know this. If I hadn't left, I would have disappeared. And with me, every memory I carry, every story, every trace of truth. Now, I can speak. I can remember. I am not free from guilt. But I am free to tell you this. The suitcase was never meant for my eyes. But once opened, it opened everything.